In the year 1865, the United States reached a turning point that would permanently reshape the nation's legal and social structure. After centuries in which slavery had existed as a central part of the economy in many regions, the country formally abolished the institution through a constitutional amendment. This moment did not happen suddenly. It was the result of decades of political conflict, moral debate, economic transformation, and ultimately a devastating civil war. Millions of people were affected, families were separated, communities were reshaped, and the legal meaning of freedom changed for an entire population. But to understand why the abolition of slavery in 1865 mattered so deeply, we must first understand the world that existed before it. Because slavery in the United States was not only a legal institution, it was an economic system, a political issue, and a source of intense national division. The path to abolition was long, complicated, and often violent, and the end of slavery did not immediately solve the deep challenges that followed, but it marked one of the most significant transformations in American history. The early history of slavery in North America. Slavery in North America began long before the founding of the United States. During the 17th century, European colonial powers established settlements across the continent. These colonies needed labor. Agriculture in particular demanded large numbers of workers. Crops such as tobacco, rice, and later cotton required intensive manual labor. At first, some colonies relied heavily on indentured servants. Indentured servants were individuals who agreed to work for a number of years in exchange for passage to the colonies. But over time, the system of racialized chattel slavery expanded. Under this system, enslaved people were treated legally as property. Their status was inherited, meaning children born to enslaved parents were also enslaved. This created a permanent labor force. By the 18th century, slavery had become deeply embedded in the economies of several colonies, particularly in the southern regions. Plantation agriculture depended heavily on enslaved labor. At the same time, enslaved people resisted in many ways. Some attempted escape, some organized revolts, others preserved cultural traditions and community structures despite severe restrictions. Even in these early periods, slavery was controversial. Moral objections were raised by religious groups such as the Quakers, but economic interests often prevailed in political decisions. Slavery and the founding of the United States. When the United States declared independence in 1776, the question of slavery was already present. The Declaration of Independence stated that all men are created equal, yet slavery remained legal in many states. This contradiction became one of the central tensions in American political development. During the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the northern states gradually began to abolish slavery. Some passed laws for immediate abolition. Others adopted gradual emancipation systems. By the early 1800s, slavery had largely disappeared in the northern states. However, in the southern states, the institution became more entrenched. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 dramatically increased the profitability of cotton production. Cotton became one of the most important exports of the United States. Plantations expanded across the southern landscape. With them, the demand for enslaved labor increased. By the mid-19th century, millions of African Americans were enslaved in the southern states. This growing divide between free states and slave states created intense political conflict. The growing national division. Throughout the first half of the 19th century, the United States struggled to balance the political power between free states and slave states. Congress attempted several compromises. One example was the Missouri Compromise of 1820. This agreement attempted to maintain a balance by admitting Missouri as a slave state and Maine as a free state. It also established a geographic line limiting the expansion of slavery in certain western territories. For a time, these compromises delayed conflict, but they did not resolve the underlying disagreement. As the United States expanded westward, the question returned repeatedly: would new territories allow slavery or prohibit it? Each decision had national consequences. Political debates became increasingly intense. Abolitionist movements in the North argued that slavery was morally wrong and should be eliminated. Meanwhile, many Southern leaders argued that slavery was essential to their economic system and social order. New political parties emerged around these issues. Public opinion hardened. By the mid-1850s, tensions had reached a critical level. The road to civil war. Several events in the 1850s increased national tensions. One was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This law allowed settlers in new territories to decide for themselves whether slavery would be allowed. The result was violent conflict in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery groups. Another turning point came in 1857 with the Dred Scott Supreme Court decision. The court ruled that African Americans could not be citizens and that Congress had limited authority to restrict slavery in the territories. This decision intensified national outrage in many northern states. Political divisions deepened further during the presidential election of 1860. The election of Abraham Lincoln was viewed by many Southern leaders as a threat to the future of slavery. Soon after the election, several Southern states chose to secede from the United States. They formed a separate government known as the Confederate States of America. In April 1861, conflict began when Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter. The American Civil War had begun. The Civil War and the question of slavery. At the beginning of the Civil War, the Union government initially framed the conflict primarily as a struggle to preserve the United States, but the issue of slavery remained central. As the war continued, the relationship between the war effort and the abolition of slavery became increasingly clear. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation. This proclamation declared that enslaved people in territories controlled by the Confederacy were to be considered free. The document had several important effects. It shifted the moral focus of the war. It discouraged foreign governments from supporting the Confederacy, and it allowed formerly enslaved individuals to join the Union military. However, the proclamation did not immediately end slavery everywhere. Its authority was limited to areas in rebellion. A permanent legal change required something more powerful, an constitutional amendment. The 13th Amendment. In 1865, after years of conflict, the United States took a decisive legal step. Congress passed the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The amendment declared that slavery and involuntary servitude would be abolished throughout the United States, except as punishment for a crime. Ratification required approval from the states. Later that year, the amendment was officially adopted. For millions of people who had been enslaved, the legal system of slavery was finally abolished. This moment marked the formal end of an institution that had existed for centuries. However, legal freedom did not immediately translate to equality. The years that followed brought enormous challenges. Formerly enslaved individuals faced economic hardship, social discrimination, and political struggle. The nation entered a new era known as Reconstruction. Transition to next section. The abolition of slavery in 1865 was a historic transformation, but it was not the end of the story. The country now faced difficult questions. How would newly freed individuals build independent lives? And they would influence the nation for generations. How would the Southern economy adjust? The answers to these questions would shape the next chapter of American history. What rights would be guaranteed under the law?